Okay, welcome everybody to our first presentation since the summer break. And we're fortunate tonight to have Doug Reed, who's going to do a presentation for us. And he invited a couple family members and people from his group. So we have kind of a mixed audience today, which is fine. And Doug, I didn't really prepare, but Doug, I guess I'll just wing it, huh? Doug was was in K-12 in the Peace Corps, and in 1974 and 1975, he was, I guess, teaching or tutoring or discussing in English issues with Kim Dae-jung, the famous Korean politician and democracy leader. And
Yes.
I was sharing with Doug by coincidence in 1975. I had gotten recruited on the Yongsan military base where I was teaching for Maryland, but I got recruited to teach one of Park Chung-hee's relatives, who was the Minister of Agriculture, Chang Duk-jin. And I used to, his driver would pick me up and I would go off and we'd discuss, important state issues. No, we would just talk about things. So anyway, Doug's been living around the world, teaching English as a second language. I presume that's what he was doing in Korea. That's what I was doing. And he's written that book that I showed you a moment ago, and I think Ed flashed it as well. But this is a book, about being at the side of Kim Dae-jung. And Doug has warned us that this isn't going to be a review of the book, but is going to be a general discussion, of that time in history for him. So, Doug, uh, the stage is yours.
안녕하십니까. 선배들이 오시라고 해 주셔서 감사하고 잘 해보겠습니다. 그리고 동료들이 와주어서 지금 션 고마워요. And I have some other folks to introduce here too. Gay Reed is here, former spouse, and we are in good contact with each other still, I'm glad to say. Oh, and my daughter, Heather, is here. Additionally, I'd like to express appreciation to Matthew Watterson, whose name you see here, because he is the one who very meticulously went through the draft of my book and turned up a number of errors. And I also liked his suggestion of the book is drawn from the notes that I took after seeing Kim Dae-jung each time. But the notes are rather sloppy. I mean, they wouldn't present well. I had to paraphrase them to put the book together. But anyway, Matthew's suggestion was that at the beginning of each chapter, I might take a direct quote from those notes, and I thought that added something to it. Oh, I've gone off in a direction I didn't know I was going to go. So let me back up a bit and read a piece to you. Of Korea, my one true love. What expressions are they that will be fished out from the muse's pond, enriched as they are by the present past experience, riding home in midnight black from Richmond Airport? These reflections trigger more comment on the present perfect, extending an appreciation now to the perfect past. So many generous gifts for which 10,000 thank yous are not enough. Thank yous to Korea, that is. And Billy Collins, who was at one point the poet laureate for the state of New York, said that all poets are thieves. I don't claim to be a poet, although I dabble in writing verse, such as I just read to you. And I also admit to being a thief. I thought Dan Holt was going to be here. He may show up later. Anyway, from him, I stole the image or the metaphor of Korea as mistress, which I think fits very well. I'd like to thank Frank Consilis for providing the platform for us to be here today. And also, I would like to express appreciation to Diane Odell, who brought this all together. And I sense that she is a key organizer in things that happen with K1. And Gay, of course, through the years has been very supportive of, well, this work with Kim Dae-jung. She's the one who introduced me to him, after all. We were both staying at the volunteer house on Sogon campus at the time. That's how I met her when I began my junior Fulbright grant. Let's see, did I want to mention anybody else? Probably, if I've forgotten, maybe it'll come back to me, or you can remind me of important folks. I'd like to single out, oh, incidentally, I'm not sure how you all proceed. I don't necessarily need to take the floor the whole way through. So if you have a question or a correction to make on facts that I assume to have been true but are not, I welcome that. The prepared spiel that I have could go on for 40 minutes, depending on whether you take me off into asking questions, which could be interesting and perhaps more exciting. So just to bring into focus what the year August of 1974 to about September of 1975, what was going on in Korea. And again, that is the time for the material in this book. One other thing I wanted to say about Gay and her support for me is that it's taken me a while to get around to this book. It was hanging over me for all this time that it should be done. You know, that little person inside that says, "Oh, you got to do this." But I ignored it for a good while, thinking I could get away without having to do it. But eventually, I pushed myself into it, and I'm very thankful that Kindle and Amazon now make it possible for anyone to publish. And so I took advantage of that, and I'm grateful to that. And oh, this reminds me of another person that I want to thank. She is not here. My sister, Deb, was key in being able to put the book together, in that she had the technical expertise and took to it like a fish in water and enjoyed the process. Anyway, what I wanted to do was to mention some of the events of 1974-75 in the larger picture, both in Korea, mostly in Korea, and a little bit on the United States. So on the 15th of August, 1974, the First Lady was assassinated. You may recall that event, Park Chung-hee's spouse. In November of 1974, President Ford made a visit to Korea. So by that, we know this is sometime not too long after the Watergate debacle. In December of 1974, George Ogle, a Methodist minister working in Korea, was kicked out of Korea, probably because he was beginning to know too much. At the end of October 1974 through to the end of February, the very valiant press freedom campaign by reporters from Donga-ilbo was in full sway, a very key event from that year. In April of 1975, there was a trumped up case of the People's Revolutionary Party, and 8 people who were totally innocent, because there was, in all likelihood, no such party. Those 8 people were executed, probably presaging a lot of the content, the discontent that ensued in Pak's eventual assassination in 1979. Also in April of 1975, Father James Sinnott was kicked out of Korea, and I may have a little bit more to say on him. And then Emergency Decree number 9, which was the flagship of oppression of those emergency decrees, happened on the 13th of May, 1975. It was promulgated and stood in force. I'd like to pause now to ask if you can hear me all right. And okay, thank you. Again, going on, unless you stop me.
So
I
you
have a
welcome
lot.
questions, right, Doug? You
Yes, I
welcome
welcome
questions?
questions.
Okay.
Yes, yes. I have a long, kind of rambling introduction and overview, which could take 20 minutes, followed by a quick run through some key items. One was, why did I get involved in this with the democracy movement? Some personal incidents and observations that allowed me to know I was being watched. No surprise there. My first visit to see Kim Dae-jung, and something on Donald Renard and Philip Habib with respect to the kidnapping of Kim Dae-jung from Japan, violating Japanese sovereignty. And if I trail off on these sidelines, I'll never get through. Anyway, Philip Habib and Donald Renard were key folks in moving quickly to see that something more dire did not happen to Kim Dae-jung, and I may have more to say on that later. I received from Chris Nottingham. Jim, you may be able to tell me what his other name is. I know it's Chris Nottingham, but he had another first name that was used. Anyway, he gave me an article written by Donald Renard's son that detailed some of those events of August 1973. Then I mentioned the People's Revolutionary Party. I have a few words to say on that. Kim Dae-jung's 4 encounters with death before his final exit in 2009. It may have been 5, but I only was able to pull up 4. Okay, so any questions at this point? So some rambling walk through before I get to those items that I just mentioned. My process in writing was to be with Kim Dae-jung for an hour, sometimes more, 2 or 3 times a week, usually. And what we did, as Frank nicely recognized, was we went over some of the events that were occurring in Korea, which was very nice to know, because of course there wasn't much in the newspapers at the time. And I did not want to interrupt our exchange where I might correct pronunciation or answer a question from him. So after I saw him, I would scurry on over to Sogang University to my room at the volunteer house and write up all that I could remember. Let's see. Oh, today, the 21st of September in the US, it's already the 22nd there in Korea, is Lee Hee-ho's birthday. So I'm kind of glad that I got to present on her birthday. I happened to be in Korea in June of 2019 when she died, and I was pleased to see the banners around Seoul showing her smiling face with a smaller inset of Kim Dae-jung in the background, representing the appreciation of the people of Korea for the role that Lee Hee-ho played in the restoration of democracy. I had 4 extended stays in Korea, by which I mean more than a couple of months, which is my usual habit now when I go to Korea. The first, as Frank mentioned earlier, before most of you came on, was when I was in the Peace Corps in the full year of 1970 to the full year ending in 1971. Then, as noted, I received a junior Fulbright lectureship for 1 year from August 1974 to about September 1975. Later, in the early 1980s, when Kim Dae-jung was exiled to the States, I was able to work as the administrative assistant at Kim Dae-jung's Korean Institute for Human Rights, and that was located in Springfield, Virginia, Northern Virginia. And more on that perhaps later. And then from the year 2000 to 2013, I was at Kyunghee University as an English classroom facilitator for those learning English in the general English program. It was while there that I met and got to know Matthew Watterson more fully, and you see him in attendance here. And as I mentioned, he did a great job of editing for me. So now I'd like to say a bit about why I like Korea, in addition to probably the thoughts that you all have about what was so good for you in having the Korean experience. I think some of mine may be a little bit different in addition to those. So when I arrived in Korea in 1970, it was February, and the landscape was rather desolate. There weren't that many trees fully grown at that time. It was not that long after the war, less than 20 years. And so the countryside looked rather bleak to me, and I had that a sinking feeling, oh, am I going to be able to stay here for 2 years? But I was very pleased as March rolled around and then on in April to see forsythia blossoming with their sprigs going out like that. And then later, azaleas. These are flowering plants that are also quite prominent in Virginia. Additionally, the climate of Korea is so similar to Virginia's, hot and sultry in the summer, and sometimes can be quite cold with an occasional large snowfall in the winter, just like Korea. And then, of course, spring and fall are more moderate. But the point I'm making is the similarity for me between Virginia and Korea. And another thing is the 38th degree parallel, which goes right through Virginia, the 38th degree latitude north. And in fact, the small town of Louisa, 15 or 20 miles north of where I am, that line goes right through that little town. This is a bit off topic, but something I was driven to explore, and Matthew Watterson will understand this. We exchange daily by way of Kakao Talk, which is very nice convenience, and often exchange involving my questions about Korea. And I was curious myself to know where the 38th degree latitude south ran through the southern hemisphere with respect to Australia. And it's off the coast of Melbourne to the south of Australia. As you travel south, and this is a little bit confusing to me, things get colder. So the point is that Australia is closer to the equator than either Korea or Virginia. Okay, enough of that. My overall um, theme that I'd like to touch on, I don't know if it's a theme, but is the generosity of Koreans uh, and the fullness of experience in being in Korea. So the gifts of love I received from Korea, generosity of Koreans often just floored me and continues to do so. Oh, so maybe 2 months ago, something like that. The middle school where I worked in 1970 and 71, I stayed in touch with two or three of those folks, and they have a Doug Reed group that can be in touch with each other by way of Kakao Talk. And so I don't think they exchanged messages all that frequently, but on this particular day, I saw that there were some exchanges, and then my phone rang. This was 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. I was up early because, well, that's just the way I am. Um, and I picked up the phone, and it was, I can say here, I think, because this is out of the loop. My favorite student um, was calling me, and I was so happy to hear from him. In fall of 2023, I had gone with him and three other students to the East Coast on an excursion that was very, very nice. I felt so well looked after by them. So the gifts of love being taken in by the Kim family, especially by Kim Dae-jung and Lee Hee-ho, but also by especially later in the early 80s, by Kim Hong-op, the second son, and his spouse, Shin Sun-run. Um, just a little mental picture. Every time I would leave the Kim household, my shoes would be turned outward. Do you remember that practice in Korea? Uh, I thought the first time I encountered it, I thought it was so nice. I think it probably still continues in some places, maybe not as much as it used to be. But anyway, my shoes were set for my departure. That was very nice. Uh, this is kind of a funny incident. It must have been about the time of the reporters' movement at the Donga Ilbo. It came time uh, for Ihiho to give me my payment. I thought I didn't need a payment. I was happy to do this work. But in any event, both of them were insistent that I should receive something. So on that day, I tried to refuse it, and she chased me around the coffee table until finally she won out. I think she must have stuffed the white envelope in one of my pockets. Perhaps my jacket was lying there on the sofa or something. And I thought, well, not that I um, told her at that time, um, but I surely would have told her later. I thought I would use that money to place an ad in the Tonga Ilbo. So after big businesses, major funding for the paper by way of advertising mysteriously disappeared, the citizenry started placing these little classified ad size strips in the paper in which they supported the reporters. And I thought I would add mine. And I had, so with that money, I placed an ad, and the experience of going to the Tonga Ilbo and placing that ad was also interesting. I don't want to go off on that right now. Um,
Yes,
another time
little stories to tell.
in conver I'll pause now. Is there a comment, question? Okay.
I think someone just didn't have their microphone muted, Doug. Go ahead.
Well, again, I welcome comments. I feel like I'm monopolizing the floor, but however, so another time Mrs. Kim offered, what can I say? It wasn't exactly solace, but comfort to me was when I was feeling Gee, I have the privilege of going regularly to see Kim Dae-jung, uh, and I have the privilege of going in and out of their house when ordinary Koreans are not able to do that. And I mentioned this to Mrs. Kim, and she said, Doug, we all do what we can. And this kind of set my mind at ease. Even though I was in a privileged position, I was doing something for the restoration of democracy. More on why it is called the restoration of democracy, if you like. Um, so anyway, another Osakan event was jumping ahead to the early 1980s when I was administrative assistant at the Korean Institute for Human Rights. I was driving Kim Dae-jung probably from an appointment in DC to the office in Springfield. And I asked if he would mind if I stopped and made a deposit at the bank. This was a mistake, but being stubborn as I was, I stayed with my decision to do this. And I went into the bank, and there was a line waiting for a teller to take care of people's business. And Kim Dae-jung sat in the lobby in something not much better, in fact, no better than one of those church folding chairs. Uh, Anyway, I waited and waited, and he patiently waited and waited and waited um, until I could get up to the teller and make that bank deposit. So embarrassed that I made this man of stature go through that. Um, Another time, not of my embarrassment, but of note, was, let's see, there are some of you who are familiar with Washington, D.C. and how it's set up. At the time in the early 1980s, I think it may have been, the situation may have been improved, but at that time there was something called the mixing bowl, where the belt loop 495 went around Washington, D.C., and I think it was 395 and 95 all came together at the same place. That was called the mixing bowl. And there may have been some other roads that came in there. And I had to move from one of the left lanes all the way over, it seemed like 7 or 8 lanes to get to the Springfield exit. And I noticed that Kim Dae-jung flinched. And this probably reminded him of having been forced off the road during the presidential campaign in 1971 when he was rather seriously injured. Fortunately, he was not killed at that time, but that was close. That was one of the near-death experiences that he counted. And he walked with a limp from that time. He referenced it as sciatica, I think. And another time that was a little bit osakata, but as I've looked back on this now and putting these notes together, I think probably it was all right. As Gay one time said, Kim Dae-jung probably appreciates being able to just have regular conversation with people. In this case, it was a lack of conversation that left me feeling a bit uncomfortable. It was just the two of us. We were in a restaurant, I believe it was a Korean restaurant not far from Yokum Parkway where he resided, and probably waiting for an appointment. It was kind of a darkened restaurant, and it was an hour or more that I had with him, just the two of us, but I couldn't think of anything to generate conversation. And as I said, probably this was just as well with him, not having to respond always to questions. Jumping back to 74, 75, one time I was asked to go into his room and he was lying flat on a yo, and he had momsal. And so I think his idea was that he wanted to tell me he couldn't work with me that day, and just to be polite, he wanted to tell me directly. I don't know if there was anything else. I want to mention the strong faith of Kim Dae-jung, who was a Catholic, as you may know. I'm pretty sure he had meetings with Cardinal Stephen Kim Soo-han. Incidentally, Kim Soo-han, is it cardinal or bishop? Anyway,
Cardinal.
Cardinal, thank you. Uh, Kim Soo-han died in 2009, as did Kim Dae-jung, and also Senator Kennedy. And I kind of see the three of them as of a certain category. But anyway, the point is that he was a strong Christian, as was Mrs. Kim, Lee Hee-ho. She was a Methodist. So they were of different practices, but they got along beautifully. I like to see the two of them together, as happened on more than one occasions when they invited me over to their place for dinner. And the two of them were on the other side of the table, and they were chatting back and forth like lovebirds, giggling and going on. And I just thought it was just lovely to see. Oh, I see I left out something which I'll just pop in here. In February of 1985, Ferris Harvey, who was the head of the North American Coalition for Human Rights in Korea, myself and Kim Dae-jung were together. And it was just before the scheduled return of Kim Dae-jung to Korea in February of 1985. And Kim Dae-jung asked the two of us, Ferris and myself, if we thought it might be an idea to postpone his return for some better date, just showing that he was always ready to do the more difficult if it presented an avenue or a better way. Sometimes, for example, he was prevented from going out, and so he would think of something else that he could do, like signing a petition or something of the sort, or contacting leaders of the democratic movement. If I didn't mention it, I will here. So the Christians in Korea were leaders in the movement for restoration of democracy. They were not the only leaders, but they were key persons. Okay, so why did I take on this possibility of working with Kim Dae-jung? Who wouldn't? I mean, it just seemed like a given thing. I didn't doubt for a moment that it was what I wanted to do. And the oppression being visited on the Korean people stirred something in my sensibilities, I think. And so I was grateful that I had this opportunity. And it's been a gratefulness that has been with me through my life. Indeed, I'm thankful. Personal incidents. So at the time, my Fulbright grant was to go, and I have another story about Ed Wright and what he had to say about my working with Kim Dae-jung, but later maybe. So I was working at the Language Teaching Research Center, which was in Gwanghwamun, and also at Sogang University. And leaving the Language Teaching Research Center, one day a kindly man came up to me and asked if we could have tea. I thought it was a little bit strange, and I wasn't ready to go for tea at that point. I wanted to think it over, I guess. But we arranged for a date, and then I asked one of my colleagues on that date to follow me, so that she might know if anything awry was up. She was willing to say something about it. But as it happened, I was able to signal her from the tea room door that everything was just fine. I didn't realize then, didn't fully realize then, as I do now, that as a U.S. citizen, there probably wasn't much chance that anybody was going to mess with me, at least not physically or in a, well, yeah, physical confrontation or something. As things for the end of my year there became complicated, I thought it would be a good idea to, so in other words, what I want to say here is that this is another example of having been in some kind of eye under observation. So I thought it might be a good idea to key folks in my family into the fact that I was in a difficult, potentially difficult situation. In fact, I was kicked out of Korea later. So I called my sister. I think it was also from Gwanghwamun, where the international telephone office was, and you would go there and make an appointment and then be assigned to a booth. And I introduced myself in that call to my sister as Kim Spanos. Her last name is Spanos. Her husband's name is Chris Spanos, and he worked for U.S. Representative Herb Harris of Northern Virginia. So I thought they might be interested to know that I was in some kind of a pickle. But it turned out I just confused things for them. Another place where it was interesting, not so much to be observed as to know a place where one could talk freely, and that was in taxi cabs. So if it was just me and the taxi cab driver, and the driver felt like he wanted to make comments, political comments, he could feel freer to do that in his own car, where it would be unlikely that there would be bugs, and even if parked people on the outside wouldn't be able to hear the conversation. And then I have a chapter in my book, I think, called Two Socks. And this is of a time when this woman came running up to me with two pairs of socks to give to me, and she had a smile. And I didn't know what it was all about, but I believe that this was in the Tonggyodong neighborhood. And I believe she must have seen me coming and going from the Kim household, and it was just her way of sending on aloha. Oh, maybe I should pick up the tempo so there's more room for you all at the end. So my first visit to Kim Dae-jung, I'm not sure whether it was with Gay or on my second visit there. I was always served coffee, and he leaned over and he asked, "How do you like your coffee?" And I said, "With creamer." At that time it was powdered cream. And he said, "How many scoops?" And I suppose I said 2. So he leaned over and dipped the creamer out and stirred it into my coffee. Just a lasting impression of his goodwill and being down to earth. Okay, I think maybe I've said enough about the work of Donald Bernard and Philip Habib, who was the ambassador to Korea from 71 to 74. I'm not sure that I mentioned these two put themselves out on a limb when they got intelligence that Kim Dae-jung had been kidnapped from Japan and was on the ocean going to Korea. They put themselves out on a limb because there wasn't time to go up through channels to get an okay to do something. They put themselves out on a limb by speaking to folks in the Pak Chonghee coterie, or larger group of folks, and saying under no circumstances should further harm come to Kim Dae-jung, and saved his life, I'm pretty sure, based on what he told me about the preparations he had seen for his death. The People's Revolutionary Party. One person in that group didn't even know why he was imprisoned. Another was a young college student who was roped into this group probably because he was tutoring at the house of one of those folks. Anyway, they were executed. And Father Sinnott and others got word of this and were out in the streets trying to block the prison bus from going forward. I believe those folks on the streets wanted an examination of the bodies to see to what extent torture had been carried out. uh, and this brings to mind, Ed, I don't know whether it was, you were there, right, Ed, at the same time when the missionaries and other folks, Fulbrighters in particular, got together to share information that we had. And we met on the top floor, I think it was the 7th or 8th floor of the Fulbright building at that time, to share information. And it was an electric sharing of information to have these people who were determined to do something to improve the situation, that were sharing all the information that they could with each other. Again, because there wasn't much published in newspapers. Okay, so
There was an Amnesty International mission there right at that time.
I didn't know.
Yeah, there's a report that you would find very interesting. One of them was a doctor who was looking at the question of torture, and the other was a barrister, British guy. The doctor was Danish, and they were speaking with the Minister of Justice the day before they were to leave, and they were assured that the death penalties, if they came down, which I think it was that afternoon,
Yes.
would not be carried out without giving a chance for due process, going through the various stages. I think an appeal within the judicial system and an appeal to the Minister of Justice, who could commute the sentences. And these guys were executed that night, and their families were never able to see their bodies. They were cremated. That's what you do with the evidence,
Ed, thanks very much for that comment, kind of bringing forward the atmosphere of that time, and also giving me a break. And I'm just about finished. So I hope others have questions or comments.
You can have more of a break if you want.
Well, I just want to do this last thing and then I'll stop. So just the 4 encounters with death, and again, I think there may have been 5. The first was in the early of Kim Dae-jung, that is, his close encounters with death. The first was in the early 50s when the North Koreans had penetrated all the way to, I think it's called the Busan perimeter, and they had set up a prison camp there with South Koreans, and Kim Dae-jung and his brother were in that group. And when it came time for the North Koreans to withdraw, they were going to slaughter all of those folks in that prison camp. And Kim Dae-jung and his brother managed to escape. I've mentioned his vehicle being forced off the road during the presidential campaign of 1971. And of course, the August 1973 kidnapping. And then after the Gwangju, I don't want to call it uprising, that sounds illegitimate. The
Massacre?
Gwangju massacre movement, I guess I would say. Anyway, at that point in 1980, Chun Doo-hwan issued a death sentence to Kim Dae-jung at that time. So there you have it. Thank you very much for your patience. And what can you say?
Well, thanks, Doug. I'm sure we have, I think Ed has another point he wanted to make. That was very interesting, and we'll ask you some questions now. Ed?
Did I have another point that I
Well,
wanted?
you said something about giving him another break. I thought that meant you had something
Oh,
else you wanted to say.
well, I think I have other things to say, but go ahead and I'll come along.
I might say, Doug, I read that when Kim Dae-jung was kidnapped, that documents came out. I think it was 2017, where it was clear that they planned to dump him in the sea.
Yeah.
That's a recorded fact. And I also read that a Japanese self defense force plane was flying closely above the boat, which would have been, I think, made them a little hesitant to commit murder, in full view. But anyway, those are just a couple things that I read. I just
Um,
Go ahead,
yeah.
Doug.
Uh, just on the August 73 kidnapping. So there was a failed attempt, according to Kim Dae-jung. He was in some hotel, and I've forgotten the name of it. Um, when these thugs came along with butcher knives and grocery bags and newspaper, uh, and they were going to kidnap Kim Dae-jung at that point. But one of his colleagues, Kim Dae-jung's colleagues, saw them, and so they were frightened away. But Kim Dae-jung thought they were going to kill him, drug him, kill him, chop up his body, and cut it off in these grocery bags or something like that. So yeah, it was pretty bad.
You know that's exactly what happened to Khashoggi in
Mm,
the consulate in Turkey, the Saudi Arabian consulate in Turkey. Only those guys succeeded
mm,
and cut him up into pieces, and his body has never been seen. But it seems like such a bizarre thing to do that it's really interesting to see that two authoritarian governments sent their thugs many years apart to do away with someone they wanted to get rid of, and came up with the same way to do it.
mm.
On the business of whether how he was going to be handled when he was on the boat, I think it's in his autobiography, but I think I also heard it directly from Kim, that he one of the crew members was preparing him for being thrown overboard by fastening weights onto his limbs. He was tied up, and it was, and the men told him what was going to happen. And then this airplane or helicopter, and I'm not quite sure why, but Kim himself was never sure whether it was a helicopter or an airplane. But it was made clear. Apparently, there was a loudspeaker message delivered,
Mm.
and it was made clear that they had better stop. And the same man, came back, took the weights off, untied Kim, and said, "I voted for you the last time."
Oh boy. So the floor is open. Anyone else has some comments or questions you'd like to make? Ingu, that's a period you know something about. Have any comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, actually, I read and today, thanks, Doug, and about your very somehow emotional still and presentation. And so I actually, personally, I had some long hours to talk with Doug about his book. Still, I still want to hear from you and about how Kim Dae-jung learned from you. Because always people's highlighting about how Kim Dae-jung great, but how actually these young Peace Corps members or Fulbright scholars could engage with Kim Dae-jung and how they could make a good impact to Kim Dae-jung. And when he thinking about the Korea and the world, because I don't know, I still want to learn more from you and all of these Peace Corps members who spend important time in Korea. And many of those people actually got a chance to directly and indirectly and talk with the Kim Dae-jung. And so how could actually you and believing that yourself and could yeah some claim your credits? Oh, I contributed Kim Dae-jung's thoughts or actions, and so yeah, you are quite modest and humble. But I want to hear from you about your own evaluation about this history.
About his what?
Oh, sorry, perhaps you couldn't. So about simply speaking, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I could hear you all right. I didn't get the last word.
He was
About
asking Doug what you might have contributed to Kim Dae-jung's thought through your discussions and so forth.
well, I like your rephrasing of that, Frank. I got it. Thank you, and thank you, Ingu. Um, I I don't have any notion that I contributed to his thinking. He contributed a lot to my thinking. Um, I was just doing what I was able to do as an English informant. And at the Institute, for example, well, there are lots of jobs there. Again, that's Springfield, Virginia. Um, but editing his speeches and then going over them, the pronunciation. Um, I'm looking at maybe I can call this a contribution. Looking at Gay, it brings it to mind. Um, so I think I mentioned in passing that Kim Dae-jung traveled with me and a Japanese television crew to Charlottesville, Virginia. I had long wanted Kim Dae-jung, to see Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. Uh, and so we did make that visit. And either before or after that visit, probably anyway, it was a matter of a day or two, um, he and that Japanese television crew came to where I was staying, and Gay and other members of the family prepared a fantastic meal for all of us. And it was just a fine time to be together with him there at the place where I was staying. My father, alive at the time and having grown up, I don't know if you all remember, I remember these signs that said George Washington slept here. They were throughout Virginia. And with that in mind, my father wanted a sign that said Kim Dae-jung slept here. So we do have that.
Okay. That's
Any
still very nice.
Yeah,
any go ahead, Ed.
I can't claim to have read every word, but I read the chapters that stuck out to me, probably 2/3 of the book. And I had not realized that you were deported. I realize it doesn't meet the legal definition of deported, maybe, but the same thing seems to be the same thing that happened to Jim Senna. Visa not renewed, and a date set for you to leave. What was that like?
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh, I haven't reviewed that in the book, which probably would refresh events for me, but it was a very harrowing time. I was thinking about it just this morning. I don't know why it popped into my head that how could I describe those guys from the Ministry of Justice or whatever it was? They were, oh, I thought I had an adjective for it anyway.
Thugs
Yeah, well, it's
with
close
black
to
leather
that. Yes. Well, they were
jackets.
sort of greasy, and they seemed to take delight in making me feel uncomfortable about. So I had to go to the Ministry of Justice to pick up my passport, which had the canceled in it, and they had me wait around, and they were just fooling around. Those guys were. Probably don't want to say too much about that, but. Oh, one thing that Kim Dae-jung told me when this was happening, that it was clear I was going to be kicked out of the country. He said, sometimes we can choose the least worst. And he said, the least worst would be for me to go and leave Korea, which I did not want to do, and continue work with the folks working for democracy in Korea. Incidentally, it bothered me that Kim Dae-jung would always refer to restoration of democracy, but this goes back to Chang Myeon's time of 1960, when it was a fairly democratic government that was overthrown in May of 1960 or 61 by Park Chung-hee. And Kim Dae-jung himself was a godson of John Chung, I think. Yeah.
He had some relation to it.
Gay, did you have something else?
Yes, I do. I think Ingu would be interested to know, maybe in particular, that as a Peace Corps volunteer, I could not teach Mr. Kim. I had to wait until I was through with Peace Corps because Peace Corps didn't want us to get involved with anything political. So it was a Jesuit priest who came to me from Sogang University one day and asked me if I wanted to teach Mr. Kim. And so that's how I happened to meet him, and then how Doug met him. And the other thing I wanted to point out was that time that Mr. Kim came with the Japanese television crew, Heather was there too. Heather and Jeff were both there. They were little kids then, and the Kims were always wonderful to the children. They liked Gim, seaweed, and they would always come with packages of seaweed for the kids. So our kids grew up on seaweed instead of potato chips. No, I don't know if that's true, but yeah. So just thought I'd add that.
Very interesting. Okay. Could you remember the name of priest?
Yes, there were two John Dailies at Sogang University. One was the president, J.P. Daly.
Yeah.
And the other one was J.V. Daly, who was he was the one, and he was a very interesting man because he chose not to live in the Shimbugan with all the other priests. He chose to live out in the community, and he worked with indigent, with people in the barrios, or I don't know what the Korean word for barrio is. Anyway, that was who it was.
Okay.
Anyone else?
I can keep going.
I'm sure of that. You want to say something else, Ed?
Well, one other thing, well, two other things maybe. There was a day when David McCann and I had lunch, together, and then we were walking back. You know, the courts used to be very near or maybe they were in Sussum. Anyway, not at all far from the Peace Corps of the Fulbright office and apartments. And as we were walking back, I think it was David who said, "Oh, you know, there's a session of Kim Ji-ha's trial today, and why don't we go and take a look?" So we went over to the courtroom and asked somebody about which one it was. Got to the doors, and the doors were closed. And then at whatever the time was, 12 o'clock, or when the trial was to begin, the doors were opened and the room was full of leather jacketed KCI men. There were no seats. I have always hoped that Kim Ji-ha saw us and realized that we were there in his support. And whenever I saw him for the rest of his life, he was always very cordial to me. So I do like to think that he got the message from us that day.
You remember that, Dave?
I do remember being there, and you know, the whole sort of dramatic, purposeful presentation of the trial and the sentencing and other things. And Kim Ji-ha knew he was, you know, part of this. And there were some other people there, but yeah, those leather jackets were really something to see. I have to add, I was trying to remember what year it was, but I visited Kim Dae-jung and shared with him this was in his residence after the retirement and trials and other things. But I shared with him a poem, a Shijo poem that my father had written about Kim Dae-jung and his efforts to bring the North and the South back into communication. And the poem ended with the little phrase, DJ knew. And my dad really admired Kim Dae-jung and all that he had done. And I shared the poem and told him how much my father had sort of picked up the spirit of all of his work. And Kim Dae-jung thanked me and then looked over to his attendant and said, "Bring a watch." And they brought out a wristwatch, and he told me to give it to my father, which I did. I took it home and gave it to my dad, and it's one of the treasures from those days. It really is.
Wow. Thanks, Dave.
Well, Ed and I have been talking about about the book, and one of the memories that I have is the day that you took a group of us from Fulbright House over to introduce us to Kim Dae-jung. And that was a really big moment for all of us, and probably a sort of a turning point in, I have to say, Ed's activism. But it was really very exciting. I don't remember exactly, must have been 74 or.
I think you have the date in the book.
That was really important to a number of people from Fulbright House at that time.
That's a 75.
75.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was April something.
Around time of what's his name actually, the congressman and the visits.
Fraser?
Yeah.
No, this was well before that.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Hey, Jim, you're mute. Oh, was he leaving?
He's coming back, I think. He's getting something.
Jim.
I think David and I are remembering two different occasions. Because the day that I'm thinking about, it was one of those sessions of the trial that took about 5 minutes. Kim Ji-ha was brought in with his arms tied behind him. There's a famous photograph showing him like that, and that's, he was wearing, I guess, prison-style hanbok, and his arms were tied behind him. He was in the room for 5 or 10 minutes and then gone. And I think David is describing a more elaborate, longer session where more important things happened. And I wasn't there on that occasion.
If I could, I'd like to share a photograph that came from a reception at the Blue House. And what I'm trying to remember now is the occasion, but there was a long line of us waiting to walk up and be greeted by the president and his wife. And as I came up to President Kim Dae-jung, he gave me that kind of official smile. But then he had just come back from a long trip through Southeast Asia, and had, I think, come back that afternoon and was having this meeting banquet at the Blue House. But in any event, there was this long line of people who came through. And then he saw me, and there was sort of this moment, and he got this lovely smile on his face. And I don't know if you can see, but somebody took a photograph of it. And
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
and me. And it was just so amazing to see the sort of open human spirit in him. He just was an amazing person, I thought, in that way.
Nice expression.
He was
Yeah.
always interested in people's families too. It was, we have a picture of Ed showing him the grandchildren.
Yeah.
It was.
In the Blue House.
Yeah, I mean, so he really, and I remember once I took our daughter to Korea in 1988 as a graduation from high school present. And I hadn't planned on visiting the Kims. I thought that was sort of too presumptuous of me or whatever. And we were with some reporters who knew us very well. And one of them was horrified that I hadn't made some kind of contact. I just didn't know that that's what I should do. So actually our daughter and I ended up having breakfast with Lee Ho. And I mean, and so every time we went, we would see them. They were very important people to a lot of, and to us as well, but to a lot of people.
Anyone else out there with some recollections or questions or comments? I'm practicing adding people to the screen, pinning 3 or 4 people at one time, it's an ongoing education, this stuff. So anyone else?
Frank, thank you for emceeing the event. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. It was really interesting. And the last part, with people adding in their recollections of events was particularly interesting. So it's 10:15. Should we break into some small groups or call it a morning afternoon? What do you suggest?
Well, I think I will depart, but it was lovely to see all of you, and good friends from Hawaii as well, and Ed and Jim. So I'll say goodbye.
Seeing
Bye.
you, Gay.
Okay,
Bye, Gay. Thanks for coming.
well, thanks for letting me attend.
Sure, sure.
Anytime.
Okay, I gotta stop. Ned Schultz is not here. I have to stop the recording. Here we go. There it is. Okay. Stop.